When I saw my godson holding that tool in his hand and calling for me, I couldn't resist and went over to see what was happening. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. Today, I want to share a story that's been on my mind for some time. It's about a complex relationship, one that left me speechless and unsure of what to do. My name is Kim. I'm 40 years old, 5'7", tall, with fair skin and a solid frame. I come from a German family, married young to Jeff, a Dutchman, when I was 25 and he was 37. We lived in Curitiba. He was infertile, something only I knew. Jeff, an engineer at a Dutch factory, had an unusual proposal for me: to have a child with a friend of his, in exchange for financial support for 18 years. The condition was that this friend had a certain request before agreeing to father the child. I accepted. A week later, Jeff's friend arrived from Holland. He spoke no Portuguese, and although he wasn't physically imposing, he was kind. We spent the week together, fulfilling Jeff's plan, and though it was strange, I knew it was what my husband wanted. But despite our efforts, I didn't conceive. Jeff then suggested adoption. He kept his promise to provide support for 18 years, but after 7 months, we parted ways. Years passed, and I often missed the child I had once cared for. My adopted son, John, was growing up, and though I saw him only occasionally, he became a handsome young man, kind, calm, and well-mannered, like his father. Then, one day, Jeff asked me to take care of John for a year while he worked in Africa. He promised financial help again, and I happily agreed. Jean was 25 now, and I was 50, but still considered attractive. Living by the beach, I dressed casually around the house, shorts, skirts, and Jean chose to sleep in my room, something I didn't question at the time. At first, everything was normal. We spent nights watching movies and playing games. But soon, things began to change. I noticed unusual things on the bed, signs that Jean was struggling with something. I confronted him gently, and he admitted he had been having certain impulses. I told him it was inappropriate, and he seemed to understand, though tension remained between us. Over time, he grew more daring, and I, caught between confusion and affection, didn't know how to respond. One night, I even found myself allowing him to act on his impulses, hoping it would ease the situation. But it only escalated. Jean began pushing boundaries, testing how far I would let him go. One night, he became particularly bold, and though I resisted at first, I found myself swept up in a confusing mix of emotions. The situation became more complex as John took control, experimenting with his own desires, sometimes bringing elements of play into our dynamic. Despite my misgivings, I couldn't bring myself to stop him. He ordered things online, outfits, props, and started creating scenarios that left me both shocked and strangely intrigued. I wasn't sure how to handle it, but I found myself going along with it, unwilling to break the connection we had formed. In public, Jean's behavior changed as well. He enjoyed putting me in situations where I had to hide what was happening, whether at a restaurant or out on the street. He thrived on pushing boundaries, taking risks, and I, for reasons I couldn't explain, followed his lead. One day, Jean invited 2 friends over, surprising me with their presence. I didn't expect it, but he wanted me to serve them, making it clear I was to play a role. I felt embarrassed yet strangely empowered by the control he exerted. As the night wore on, and after the guests left, John and I were alone again. He pushed me further, leading me into increasingly daring situations. I felt torn, unsure of how far I was willing to go, but unwilling to lose him. By the end, Jean had taken full control, and I found myself living in a state of constant anticipation, unsure of what he would do next, but always expecting more. The once playful moments had turned into something darker and more intense, leaving me questioning my own boundaries and desires. This is just the beginning of what happened between John and me. If you're curious to hear more about this story, leave a comment and let me know. After that night, things between John and me seemed to settle into a strange routine. He no longer asked for permission to push boundaries, and I found myself increasingly passive, going along with his desires. I could feel a shift in the dynamic between us, with Jean becoming more confident, more assertive, as if he were testing my limits. At times, I would catch myself wondering how things had come to this point. There were moments when I felt guilty, questioning my own role in what was unfolding. Jean had taken control, and yet I hadn't stopped him. I couldn't bring myself to break away from the connection we had, even if it felt wrong. It was a confusing mix of affection, dependence, and something darker that I couldn't quite name. One evening, Jean suggested we spend the weekend away from home, just the two of us. We went to a small beach town nearby, a place where nobody knew us. It felt like an escape from reality, and yet I knew it wasn't. Jean booked us a single room, and although the arrangement seemed innocent, there was an unspoken tension between us. That night, after dinner, we returned to the room, and the air between us was heavy with anticipation. Jean didn't waste any time. He started to assert his desires, this time with even more confidence, and I felt myself slipping further into a state of submission, unsure of how to respond. By now, our roles had reversed entirely. Jean was no longer the shy boy I had once known. He was in control, and I was the one following his lead. He would tell me what to wear, how to act, and I, caught in the moment, would comply without hesitation. It was as if I had become an actress in a play he was directing. As the weekend progressed, Jean began to introduce new elements into our dynamic. He brought up ideas that, at first, I resisted, but eventually gave into. I didn't know how to say no to him anymore. I was afraid of losing him, afraid that if I pushed back, he would leave me, and I'd be alone again. The thought of being without him, of being abandoned, terrified me. When we returned home, things only escalated. John's behavior grew bolder, more demanding, and I found myself complying more and more. He would test me, sometimes in public, sometimes in private, always pushing the limits of what I was willing to do. And yet I never said no, I couldn't. I was too far gone, too deeply invested in this strange, twisted relationship. One afternoon, while we were out for a walk, Jean stopped in front of a shop and pointed to something in the window. It was a piece of jewelry, a delicate chain. He smiled at me and told me he wanted me to wear it, not as an accessory, but as a symbol of our connection, our secret. I didn't resist. I let him place the chain around my neck, and from that moment on, I felt marked, claimed by him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. As time went on, Jean became more possessive. He would watch me closely, making sure I followed his instructions, never letting me stray too far from the role he had created for me. I had become someone else, someone I didn't recognize, and yet I couldn't stop. I couldn't walk away from him. One night, after a particularly intense moment between us, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this. Jean was asleep beside me, peaceful, as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything was different. I was no longer sure who I was or what I wanted. All I knew was that I was trapped, caught in a web of emotions and desires that I couldn't untangle. The next day, Jean told me he had plans for us, something that would take our relationship to the next level. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask for details. I simply nodded, knowing that whatever he had in mind, I would go along with it. I had no choice. I was too far in. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense emotions and increasingly daring moments. Jean had taken control completely, and I had surrendered to him. I felt like a passenger in my own life, watching as things spiraled further and further out of my control. But even as I lost myself in this strange dynamic, part of me felt alive, exhilarated by the thrill of it all. Eventually, I knew there would be a breaking point. Jean's demands were growing more extreme, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up. But I also knew that I couldn't stop. I had given him everything, and now there was no turning back. As time passed, I started noticing subtle shifts in Jean's behavior. He became more demanding, not just in private but also in public. He would subtly test how much control he could exert over me, whether by guiding my actions with a word or a glance, or by quietly issuing instructions when no one else was around. And I, feeling the weight of my own dependence on him, found myself increasingly compliant. There were moments where I felt like I should pull back, but then there were times when John's attention and dominance felt like something I craved. It was a complicated mix of emotions: fear, excitement, and vulnerability. I had crossed too many lines and no longer knew how to step back. One day, John came to me with a new request, one that pushed my boundaries even further. He wanted to introduce a third person into our dynamic. The suggestion caught me off guard, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. My instinct was to refuse, but I could see that John was serious, and part of me was afraid that if I said no, I would lose him altogether. He was careful with his approach, framing it as a natural next step for us. He explained that it wasn't about replacing me, but about expanding our relationship, testing the limits of what we had already built. Despite my hesitation, I agreed, though I wasn't entirely sure why. The day came when John invited his friend over. I was nervous, unsure of how to handle the situation, but John was calm, in control, as always. He guided me through it, reassuring me that everything would be fine. His confidence put me at ease, at least for a while. The experience itself was intense, more than I had anticipated. It was a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, fear, and a strange sense of detachment, as if I was watching everything unfold from outside my body. Jan remained in control the entire time, directing both me and his friend with a precision that made it clear he had thought this through. I followed his lead, unable to resist the pull of his authority. Afterward, I was left with a strange sense of emptiness. John seemed pleased, satisfied with how things had gone, but I felt disconnected, unsure of how I truly felt about what had just happened. I had crossed yet another line, and I wasn't sure how to find my way back. In the days that followed, Jean acted as if nothing had changed, but I could feel the shift in our dynamic. He was pushing me further and further, testing the limits of what I would do for him, and I was struggling to keep up. Every day felt like a new challenge, a new test of my loyalty and submission. One evening, after another intense encounter, I finally confronted him. I asked Jean if he still saw me as the same person I was before, or if I had become something else in his eyes. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. His response was calm, measured, but it shook me to my core. "You're more than you were before," he said. "You've grown, evolved, become something stronger, but you're still mine." His words sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't sure if I should feel empowered or trapped by what he had just said. Part of me wanted to believe that I had become stronger, that I had gained something from all of this, but another part of me knew that I had lost something along the way, something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions and intense experiences. John continued to push me, and I continued to follow. There were moments when I felt completely out of control, but I also felt a strange sense of liberation in surrendering to him. It was as if I had given up the struggle and accepted my new reality, even if that reality was one I hadn't chosen. One day, Jing came to me with yet another proposition. This time, it was more extreme than anything we had done before. He wanted to take things to a level I hadn't even imagined. My instinct was to refuse, to finally draw a line and say that I couldn't go any further. But when the moment came, I found myself hesitating. John's gaze was intense, and I could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on me. I knew that if I said no, it would change everything. Our relationship had become a series of tests, and this was the ultimate one. If I refused, I would lose him. If I agreed, I would lose myself. In the end, I made my choice. What happened after that is difficult to put into words. It was a moment of complete surrender, a point of no return. Jean had taken me to the very edge of what I thought I could handle, and then he pushed me beyond it. I wasn't sure how I felt about it, whether I was terrified, exhilarated, or both. All I knew was that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Now, As I sit here and reflect on everything that's happened, I realize that my relationship with Jean has changed me in ways I never expected. I've learned things about myself that I never would have discovered otherwise, about my limits, my desires, and my capacity to submit. But I've also lost something along the way. Jean and I are still together, but the dynamic between us is different now. I'm no longer sure who I am outside of this relationship. I've become so entwined with John's desires and expectations that I'm not sure where he ends and I begin. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between John and me became even more complicated. I found myself drifting further from who I used to be, becoming more absorbed in the role that John had crafted for me. It wasn't just a matter of submission anymore. It was as though I had been reshaped, molded into someone else entirely. John seemed to sense this shift too. He no longer asked for my consent before pushing me into new situations. Instead, he assumed that I would go along with whatever he had planned, and most of the time, I did. I had become so wrapped up in the intensity of our relationship that I didn't know how to say no anymore. It wasn't just about losing Jean. I was afraid of losing the version of myself that had been created in this process. One night, after a particularly tense encounter, Jean suggested we take a break from the intensity. He wanted us to spend a few days apart, to clear our minds. His suggestion surprised me. I had grown so accustomed to being at his side, to following his lead, that the thought of being without him felt disorienting. But I agreed, hoping that some distance would give me the clarity I so desperately needed. The days apart were strange. At first, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I spent time reconnecting with myself, doing things I hadn't done in months, reading, walking along the beach, even just sitting in silence and letting my mind wander. But as the days went on, a creeping sense of loneliness began to settle in. I missed Jean. I missed the intensity of our connection, even though I knew it was unhealthy. When we finally reunited, the air between us was charged with anticipation. It felt like we had both been holding our breath, waiting for this moment. Jean was different, calmer, more thoughtful, but I could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken desires that still lingered between us. That night, Jean told me that he had been thinking about our relationship, about how far we had come, and how much further we could go. He spoke softly, carefully, as if choosing his words with precision. He wanted to explore new territory, to take things even further, but this time, he said, he would let me set the boundaries. His offer caught me off guard. For so long, I had been following Jean's lead, letting him dictate the terms of our relationship. Now, for the first time, he was giving me the chance to decide how far I was willing to go. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to take control, to set firm limits, and regain some sense of autonomy. But another part of me, the part that had grown dependent on Jean's dominance, was afraid. Afraid that if I set boundaries, if I said no, it would change everything between us. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. In the end, I told Jean that I needed time to think. He accepted my answer without question, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of control over my own life again. The following weeks were filled with introspection. I found myself questioning everything: my relationship with Jean, my sense of identity, my desires, and my future. I knew that I couldn't continue down the path we were on indefinitely. Something had to change, but I wasn't sure what, or how to make that change happen. One evening, while we were sitting together on the porch watching the sunset, Jean turned to me and asked a question that I wasn't expecting. "Are you happy?" The simplicity of his question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Was I happy? I wasn't sure anymore. There were moments when I felt exhilarated, alive in ways I had never experienced before. But there were also moments when I felt trapped, suffocated by the intensity of our relationship. It was a complex mix of emotions, and I didn't know how to untangle them. Jean didn't press for an answer. He just looked at me with a quiet understanding, as if he knew that I was struggling to find clarity. In that moment, I realized that he was giving me space. Space to figure out who I was outside of him, outside of this relationship that had consumed so much of my life. The next few days were quieter between us. Jean seemed more thoughtful, more patient, and I found myself slowly reclaiming parts of myself that I had forgotten. I started setting small boundaries, not just with Jean, but with myself. I began to rediscover the things that made me feel whole, independent of the intense dynamic we had shared. One afternoon, as we sat together in comfortable silence, Jean took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. He didn't say anything, but in that moment I felt a shift between us. A softening, an understanding that we were both navigating something complicated but necessary. Our relationship was changing. I could feel it. And while I wasn't sure what the future held, I knew that I had taken the first step toward finding balance again. As time went on, Jean and I began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't as intense as before, but there was still a subtle undercurrent of tension between us, an awareness that we were in the process of redefining our relationship. Jean was more patient now, giving me space to explore my own boundaries, but I could still see in his eyes that he was waiting for me to make the next move. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Jean suggested we go out for the night. He wanted to take me to a place we had never been before, a small, intimate venue where he said we could relax and let go. The way he described it made me feel a mix of curiosity and nervousness. I agreed, unsure of what to expect, but willing to follow his lead, this time with a clearer sense of my own limits. We arrived at the venue, a dimly lit lounge tucked away in the quieter part of town. The atmosphere was different from anywhere we had been before, more refined, but still charged with a subtle energy. Jean led me to a table near the back, where we could observe the room without being the center of attention. For a while, we simply sat there, sipping our drinks and talking, the conversation light and easy. But as the night wore on, I could feel Jean's gaze becoming more intense. He wasn't pressuring me, but there was a silent invitation in his eyes, a question of whether I was ready to take things further again. This time, though, I felt different. I was no longer the passive participant I had been before. I had learned something about myself during our time apart, and now I felt more in control of my own desires. I leaned in and whispered to him that I was ready to try something new, but only on my terms. Jean smiled, clearly pleased with my newfound confidence, and we both stood up, heading towards a more private section of the lounge. The air between us was charged, but this time it was different. I was the one setting the pace, and Jean was following my lead. That night marked a turning point in our relationship. For the first time, I felt like an equal partner in our dynamic. The power struggle that had once defined us was shifting, and we were finding a new balance. It wasn't about dominance or submission anymore. It was about understanding each other's needs, respecting each other's boundaries, and exploring our connection in a way that felt safe and exciting for both of us. In the days that followed, Jean and I continued to grow closer, but in a way that was different from before. The intensity was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound respect and understanding. We were both learning how to communicate better, how to express our desires without losing sight of each other's boundaries. Jean, for his part, became more considerate, more mindful of how I felt. He no longer pushed me into situations I wasn't ready for. Instead, he would ask me what I wanted, what I was comfortable with, and we would make decisions together. It was a refreshing change, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a say in how our relationship progressed. One evening, after we had spent the day together by the beach, Jean and I sat down to talk. It wasn't the usual casual conversation. We both knew there were things we needed to address, things that had been left unsaid for too long. "I've been thinking," Jean began, his voice softer than usual, "about us, about everything we've been through." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I know I've pushed you," he said, his gaze fixed on mine. "Sometimes too far, and I want you to know that I'm sorry for that. I got caught up in my own desires, and I didn't think enough about what you needed." His words took me by surprise. For so long, Jean had been the one in control, the one dictating the terms of our relationship. Hearing him acknowledge his mistakes, to see him vulnerable, was something I hadn't expected. I appreciate that, I replied, my voice steady. And I want you to know that I take responsibility too. I let things go too far because I was afraid of losing you. But I've realized that I need to be true to myself too, not just to you. The conversation marked a significant change for us. It was the first time we had truly opened up to each other. The first time we had acknowledged the complexity of our relationship and the mistakes we had both made. And in that moment, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. From that point forward, our relationship became less about pushing boundaries and more about mutual respect and exploration. We still had our moments of intensity, but they were balanced by a deeper understanding of each other's needs. It was no longer about power or control. It was about trust and connection. As the months passed, John and I continued to evolve. Our relationship was far from conventional, but it worked for us. We had learned to communicate, to respect each other's boundaries, and to find joy in the moments of connection we shared. The intensity was still there, but it was tempered by a sense of mutual respect and understanding that had been missing before. I no longer felt trapped or uncertain. I had found my voice, my sense of self, and I knew that whatever happened next, I would be able to face it with confidence. Jean and I had come a long way, and while our journey wasn't always easy, it had brought us to a place of mutual respect and understanding. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinker Bell to receive notification every time.